The emergency department had fallen strangely quiet. Rain struck the hospital windows while the night shift struggled to keep up with a sudden stream of injured patients from a highway explosion. Near the back hallway, a woman in plain blue scrubs pushed a cart filled with medical supplies. Nobody looked at her twice. "Emily," one doctor called without even turning around. "Stockroom 3 is empty again." She simply nodded. Another nurse whispered, "She barely talks." Then the deep thunder of helicopter blades rolled across the roof. Not one, two, then 4. Outside, Black Hawk helicopters descended onto the hospital parking lot. Military vehicles sealed every entrance. Armed soldiers flooded through the doors. The entire emergency room froze. Their commander removed his helmet and scanned every face before speaking only one sentence. "We are looking for Nurse Viper." Silence. Doctors exchanged confused looks. Security guards reached for their radios. The supply nurse quietly closed the cabinet she had been organizing. And for the first time that night, everyone realized they had been looking at the wrong person all along. The rain had started before sunset. By midnight, it covered the windows of Riverside Memorial Hospital in thin streams that blurred the lights from the streets outside. The emergency department never truly slept, but nights like this carried a different kind of pressure. Ambulances arrived one after another, stretchers rolled through automatic doors, and every hallway echoed with hurried footsteps and short conversations. Doctors moved quickly from room to room. Nurses checked monitors, prepared medication, and comforted anxious families. Orderlies pushed patients toward imaging. Somewhere in the middle of all that controlled chaos walked a woman whose presence almost everyone overlooked. Her name was Emily Carter. She wore the same blue hospital scrubs as everyone else. A plain identification badge hung from her collar. It read, "Emily Carter, Supply Nurse." Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. She kept her dark brown hair tied neatly behind her head. Her sleeves were rolled just enough to keep them clear while lifting heavy boxes. Comfortable black shoes carried her quietly across polished hospital floors. Every night she pushed the same gray supply cart. Inside it were gloves, 4 kits, bandages, syringes, saline bags, sterile dressings, and dozens of other items that kept the emergency department functioning. Few people noticed her. Most simply expected the supplies to appear. Dr. Michael Bennett walked past without slowing. "Emily." She looked up. "Room 12 is almost out of 4 tubing. I'll refill it. Thanks." He was already gone before she finished speaking. Emily turned the cart without complaint. She had worked at Riverside Memorial for nearly 3 years. Many of the younger nurses still thought she had started only months ago. Not because she was new. Because she never tried to stand out. At the nurses' station, Sarah Collins glanced toward Emily while entering patient notes into a computer. "I still don't understand her," Sarah said quietly. Another nurse looked over. "Who?" "Emily. What about her? I've never heard her complain." The other nurse smiled. "Maybe she doesn't have anything to complain about." Sarah shook her head. "No one works nights for 3 years without complaining." They laughed softly before returning to work. Emily walked past carrying fresh supplies. She had heard every word. She gave no sign. Storage room 3 looked different from every other supply room in the hospital. Everything had a place. Every shelf was labeled. Every expiration date faced outward. Nothing blocked the emergency exits. Nothing sat where it did not belong. Emily paused before replacing a box of syringes. One package sat 2 centimeters farther forward than the rest. She quietly aligned it. To anyone else, the movement seemed meaningless. To Emily, order prevented mistakes. Mistakes in hospitals could cost lives. Near 2 in the morning, an elderly patient suddenly lost consciousness in the waiting area. Several staff members rushed forward. Emily was halfway down the hallway when she heard a metal water bottle strike the floor. She stopped instantly. Without looking toward the nurses' station, she changed direction. By the time the code team reached the waiting room, Emily had already lowered the patient's head safely, cleared the surrounding chairs, and positioned an oxygen cylinder within reach. She stepped backward as the emergency physician arrived. Dr. Bennett barely looked at her. "Good." Emily simply nodded. Within seconds, she disappeared back into the hallway. The patient survived. Most people assumed luck had placed the oxygen tank nearby. Only one person noticed otherwise. Hospital security supervisor Daniel Brooks watched the security cameras from the control room. He rewound the recording. Emily had reacted before anyone else even recognized the emergency. Daniel frowned. Interesting. At 3:15 a.m., Emily entered the basement supply corridor. Unlike the busy emergency department upstairs, the basement was silent. Concrete walls stretched beneath rows of fluorescent lights. She unlocked a storage cage and removed several trauma supply cases. Each one weighed nearly 30 kilograms. She lifted them without visible effort. A maintenance worker happened to pass. "You want help with those?" Emily smiled politely. "I've got them." He watched her carry 2 heavy cases at once. "You're stronger than you look." She only nodded. Back upstairs, the emergency department continued filling with patients. The weather had caused multiple vehicle accidents across the county. The waiting room overflowed. Staff members hurried from one emergency to another. Emily quietly refilled crash carts, checked oxygen cylinders, restocked trauma rooms, replaced missing medications. No one thanked her. She never expected them to. Just before 4 in the morning, Dr. Bennett stopped beside the supply cart. "Emily." "Yes, doctor." "Do we have another portable ventilator?" "Storage room 5. I checked." "You checked the front shelf?" He looked confused. "There are 2 units behind the pediatric transport equipment." He walked away. 2 minutes later, he returned carrying exactly what she had described. "I didn't know those were there." Emily gave a small smile. "They were moved yesterday." "You remember all of that?" "I try." He stared for a moment before answering another pager. Outside, the rain finally began to slow. Inside, Riverside Memorial remained busy. Few people noticed Emily crossing the corridor again. But Daniel Brooks did. He watched another camera. Then another. Then another. Emily never rushed. Yet somehow she always arrived where she was needed seconds before everyone else. She seemed to know the building better than the blueprints. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Who exactly are you, Emily Carter?" Far beyond the hospital grounds, several black SUVs rolled silently along a dark highway. Their headlights remained off. Inside the lead vehicle, a man in a black tactical jacket studied a photograph under a small reading light. It showed a woman wearing ordinary blue hospital scrubs. Across the bottom of the photograph, one handwritten word appeared. "Viper." The convoy continued toward Riverside Memorial without slowing. The clock above the emergency department nurses' station read 4:12 a.m. The storm had weakened, but the hospital remained as busy as ever. Paramedics continued bringing in patients from road accidents caused by the rain. Every treatment room was occupied. Hallways filled with the steady rhythm of monitors, footsteps, and distant conversations. Emily Carter quietly pushed her supply cart toward the trauma bay. She noticed things most people never did. A missing box of gloves. An oxygen cylinder that was almost empty. A wheelchair parked just a few inches too close to a fire exit. Without speaking, she corrected each one before moving on. For everyone else, they were small details. For Emily, small details often decided whether a crisis stayed under control. Dr. Michael Bennett entered the medication room, rubbing tired eyes. "Emily." She looked up. "Could you bring 2 more blood warmers to Trauma 2? "They're already there." He frowned. "I just came from there." "You checked the left cabinet." He opened the cabinet again. This time he looked at the lower shelf. 2 blood warmers sat exactly where she had said. Dr. Bennett shook his head with a tired smile. "I swear you know this hospital better than the architects." Emily simply continued arranging 4 fluids. "I've spent a lot of nights here." A loud burst of radio traffic echoed from the ambulance entrance. Everyone looked up. Another ambulance had arrived. The rear doors opened. 2 paramedics rolled out a young man lying unconscious on a stretcher. His clothes were burned in several places. His hands were covered with shallow cuts. A deep wound stretched across his shoulder. Yet something about him immediately caught Emily's attention. Not the injuries. The boots. Heavy black tactical boots. Military quality. Not something an ordinary construction worker or office employee would wear. One bootlace had been tied using a specific emergency knot. Emily recognized it instantly. She said nothing. Male, approximately 35, one paramedic reported. No identification. No wallet. No phone. Found alone near Highway 8 after the fuel tanker explosion. Dr. Bennett began his examination. Pupils reactive. Pulse stable. Prepare for CT. The patient never opened his eyes. Emily quietly collected the patient's burned clothing and placed everything into an evidence bag. As she lifted the jacket, something slipped from an inside pocket. A small black coin. Barely larger than a poker chip. No writing. Only a silver symbol pressed into the metal. Emily looked at it for less than a second. Then she placed it back inside the evidence bag without changing her expression. No one else had noticed. Across the room, Nurse Sarah Collins watched Emily. "You okay?" Emily looked over. "Yes." "You looked surprised." "I was thinking." "About what?" Emily gave a small smile. "The laundry department won't like this jacket." Sarah laughed softly. "You always think about strange things." Emily returned to work. She had no intention of explaining what she had actually recognized. Hospital security supervisor Daniel Brooks arrived minutes later. "What's the situation?" Dr. Bennett answered while reviewing scans. "Unknown male. No identification. Possible blast injuries." Daniel nodded. "I'll notify local police." Emily continued replacing supplies in silence. She noticed something Daniel did not. The patient's left wrist carried a faint tan line. Something had recently been removed. Not a watch. A wide tactical strap. Someone had taken it before emergency crews arrived. Nearly 30 minutes passed. The emergency department slowly settled back into its normal rhythm. Emily entered storage room 5. She replaced several trauma kits. As she closed the cabinet door, she stopped. Complete silence. For almost 3 seconds. No footsteps. No voices. No equipment moving. Hospitals were never completely silent. She waited. Then, the distant sound of a diesel engine echoed outside. Not unusual. But then another. And another. 3 identical engines. They stopped at nearly the same moment. Emily walked toward the small basement window. Dark SUVs sat across the far side of the parking lot. Their headlights were off. The engines remained running. No one stepped out. She watched for another 5 seconds. Then quietly returned to work. At the nurse's station, Sarah stretched her shoulders. "I think tonight is finally calming down." Emily placed fresh saline bags onto a shelf. "I hope you're right." Before Sarah could answer, the hospital phone rang. Reception transferred the call to security. Daniel Brooks listened carefully. His expression changed. "You saw what?" He glanced toward the front entrance. "When?" "No, don't approach them." "I'm coming." He ended the call. Dr. Bennett looked up. "Problem." Parking security reported several vehicles sitting outside. "So, they've been there almost 20 minutes. Maybe visitors." "Maybe." Daniel wasn't convinced. Emily quietly continued checking inventory. She looked completely unconcerned. Inside, however, her thoughts were moving with calm precision. 3 vehicles. Lights off. No one entering. No one leaving. Watching. Waiting. Not random. Purposeful. She had seen that pattern before. Years ago. In another place. Under very different circumstances. She pushed the memory away. That life no longer belonged to her. She was Emily Carter. Supply nurse. Nothing more. Upstairs, the unconscious patient suddenly stirred. His heart rate climbed. Monitors began to beep. Dr. Bennett hurried to the bedside. The man's eyes opened for only a second. His breathing became faster. He grabbed Dr. Bennett's sleeve with surprising strength. His lips barely moved. Only 2 words escaped. "They found." Before anyone could lean closer, he lost consciousness again. The monitor stabilized. The room fell silent. "What did he say?" Sarah whispered. "No idea," Dr. Bennett replied. Emily stood in the doorway holding a fresh 4 kit. Her expression remained calm. But she had heard every syllable. And for the first time that night, she became certain. Whoever that man was, someone dangerous was already on their way to Riverside Memorial Hospital. At 5:03 a.m., the rain finally stopped. A cold mist drifted across the parking lot of Riverside Memorial Hospital, softening the glow of the streetlights. Inside, the emergency department carried on as it always did. Nurses moved between patient rooms, doctors reviewed scans, and the smell of antiseptic filled the air. To most of the staff, the night felt as though it was slowly returning to normal. Emily Cotter knew better. She finished stocking a crash cart outside Trauma Room 2 and quietly looked toward the main entrance. The 3 black SUVs were still there. They had not moved. Security Supervisor Daniel Brooks stood beside the reception desk, watching the security monitors. Camera 1 showed the parking lot. Camera 3 covered the ambulance entrance. Camera 6 overlooked the east hallway. Everything appeared calm. Too calm. His radio crackled. "Front desk to security." Daniel answered immediately. "Go ahead." 5 men just entered through the main entrance. "They're asking about a patient." Daniel glanced toward the monitor. 5 men, all wearing dark gray jackets with small identification badges clipped to their pockets. Professional. Clean. Calm. Not one of them looked nervous. Yet something about them felt wrong. "I'll be there." The automatic doors slid open. The 5 men entered without hesitation. Their leader appeared to be in his early 40s. Tall, clean-shaven, short brown hair. His movements were controlled, almost mechanical. He smiled politely at the receptionist. "Good morning. My name is Richard Kane." He placed a leather identification wallet on the counter. "We're with a federal investigative task force." The receptionist looked uncertain. "Can I help you?" "We're searching for an unidentified male brought in within the last hour." "I'm afraid I can't release patient information." Kane nodded politely. "I understand." His smile never changed. "But this concerns national security." Daniel Brooks arrived before the receptionist could respond. "I'm Daniel Brooks, hospital security." Kane turned toward him. "Perfect." He offered his identification again. Daniel examined it carefully. It looked official. The photograph matched. The seal appeared genuine. Still, something bothered him. "Can I make a copy of this?" Kane smiled. "Of course." Daniel handed it back. "I'll also need confirmation from hospital administration." Naturally. Everything about the conversation sounded normal, professional, respectful. But Emily, passing with her supply cart, noticed something entirely different. None of the 5 men looked around with curiosity. They weren't admiring the hospital. They weren't searching for signs. Their eyes measured distances, doorways, security cameras, escape routes. Every few seconds, one of them glanced toward another without speaking. Tiny movements, barely noticeable. Professional communication. Emily continued walking as though she had seen nothing. Inside the intensive care unit, the unidentified patient remained unconscious. His condition was stable. Sarah Collins adjusted an 4-line. "He still hasn't woken up." Dr. Bennett nodded. "Keep monitoring him." Neither of them noticed Emily quietly replacing supplies near the doorway. She wasn't watching the patient. She was watching the hallway outside. Richard Kane stood patiently beside Daniel Brooks. "We don't want to interfere with hospital operations." "I appreciate that. We simply need to verify whether the individual is here." Daniel folded his arms. "I'll still need authorization." Kane nodded again. "We'll wait." Behind him, One of his men briefly adjusted his jacket. Just enough for Emily to notice the outline beneath the fabric. Not a radio. A concealed pistol. Hospital security officers were armed. Federal investigators rarely carried weapons hidden that way inside hospitals. Another detail. Another warning. Emily entered storage room 4. She closed the door behind her. For the first time all night, she allowed herself one slow breath. Richard Kane. The name meant nothing. His behavior meant everything. She replayed every movement she had seen. Spacing between team members. Eye contact. Body positioning. Weight balanced slightly forward. They moved like men expecting violence. Not investigators. Operators. She opened a cabinet and removed a box of surgical masks. Then she returned to work. No panic. No rush. Just preparation. Daniel finally received a call from hospital administration. They've confirmed your credentials. Kane smiled politely. Thank you. But one of my officers will accompany you. That's perfectly acceptable. Daniel gestured toward the elevator. This way. The 5 men followed. Emily watched them disappear upstairs. Then she quietly changed direction. Instead of returning to the emergency department, she walked through a staff-only corridor that connected to the intensive care unit from the opposite side. She arrived there almost 2 minutes before the visitors. No one noticed. Sarah looked up. Emily, can you help me move bed 6 into isolation room 3? Sarah blinked. Why? The oxygen outlet is malfunctioning. It is. I reported it earlier. Sarah sighed. I must have missed the message. Together they rolled the unconscious patient toward the isolation room. Emily's voice remained calm. Take the longer hallway. It's quieter. Sarah nodded without questioning her. By the time Richard Kane reached the original room, the bed was empty. He stopped. His polite smile faded for the first time. Where is the patient? Dr. Bennett looked surprised. He was transferred. When? Just now. To which room? I'm not authorized to tell you. For one brief second, Richard Kane's eyes hardened. Then the smile returned. I understand. He turned toward his team. Let's continue. His voice remained polite. But one of his men subtly touched the earpiece hidden beneath his collar. Emily saw the movement from the far end of the hallway. Confirmation. Coordinated communications. Exactly what she had expected. Daniel Brooks stepped closer. Everything all right? Kane nodded. Perfectly. But Daniel no longer believed him. Neither did Emily. The game had begun. The men had entered the hospital peacefully. Now they were searching room by room. Not because they were investigating. Because they were hunting. And Emily Carter, the quiet supply nurse who rarely spoke above a whisper, had just made the first move without anyone realizing it. Far above the hospital, hidden beyond the clouds, the faint sound of distant rotor blades carried across the early morning sky. No one inside noticed them. The first light of dawn had not yet reached the city. Inside Riverside Memorial Hospital, the fluorescent lights painted every hallway the same pale white. Patients slept behind closed doors, monitors beeped steadily, and exhausted nurses tried to finish the longest shift of the week. On the surface, everything appeared calm. Underneath, the hospital had become a battlefield where almost no one realized a fight had already begun. Only Emily Carter understood. She stepped into the supply room and quietly closed the door behind her. Instead of rushing, she stood perfectly still. She listened. Footsteps. One pair moving down the east corridor. Another stopping outside the intensive care unit. A third set approaching the emergency stairwell. Different rhythms. Different weights. She pictured the hospital floor in her mind. 5 men. No longer together. They had spread out. Not to search. To control. Emily opened her eyes. They're setting a perimeter, she whispered to herself. She picked up 2 boxes of surgical gloves and walked back into the hallway as if nothing had happened. Daniel Brooks met Dr. Michael Bennett outside the ICU. I don't like this. Bennett frowned. You think they're lying? I don't know. But real investigators ask questions. They're barely asking any. Before Bennett could answer, Richard Kane approached them with the same calm smile. Apologies for the inconvenience. We still haven't located the patient. Daniel crossed his arms. My officer is checking the transfer records. Kane nodded politely. We appreciate your cooperation. Then he looked directly at Emily as she passed with her supply cart. For someone working supplies. He smiled. You seem to be everywhere. Emily met his eyes for the first time. Someone has to keep the hospital running. She continued walking. Neither of them looked back. In Isolation Room 3, Sarah Collins checked the unconscious patient's bandages. She heard a soft knock. Emily stepped inside. How is he? No change. Emily adjusted a monitor cable. You should move the portable oxygen cylinder to the other side of the bed. Sarah looked confused. Why? It'll give the doctors more room if they need emergency access. Sarah nodded. Good idea. She moved it without another question. Emily glanced around the room. 2 exits. 1 window. Medical cabinet. No obstacles. She quietly unlocked the second door leading into the staff corridor. Then she left. Sarah never noticed. Richard Kane watched Emily disappear down the hallway. One of his men stepped beside him. Her. Kane answered without moving his eyes. No. She's observant. But she's only staff. Still. He continued watching. Something about her calmness bothered him. Everyone else looked tired. Stressed. Distracted. Emily looked comfortable. At the nurses' station, the morning shift began arriving. Fresh staff entered carrying coffee cups and backpacks. The emergency department became even busier. Perfect cover. Emily quietly changed the assignment board. Room 12 became Room 14. Isolation Room 3 became listed as maintenance. No alarms. No announcements. Just 2 lines erased and rewritten. Most staff never noticed. But anyone following patient records would lose valuable minutes. Daniel's radio crackled. Security. Go ahead. Camera 9 just went offline. Daniel frowned. What happened? No signal. I'll check it. Emily overheard the conversation while replacing bandages nearby. 1 camera. Then another. Not random. Someone was creating blind spots. She entered a side hallway and looked upward. The security camera above the ceiling corner hung motionless. Its tiny indicator light had gone dark. Emily didn't touch it. Instead, she followed the cable with her eyes. Someone had disconnected power farther down the corridor. Professional. Clean. No visible damage. Again. Not investigators. Meanwhile, Richard Kane's team quietly repositioned themselves. 1 remained near the elevators. 1 waited beside the emergency exit. Another stood close to the ambulance entrance, pretending to answer phone calls. Patients walked past without concern. Doctors barely noticed them. To everyone else, they were simply government officials. Emily pushed her supply cart toward pediatrics. A little boy sitting in the hallway smiled at her. Are you a nurse? She smiled gently. Yes. Are you busy? A little. My dinosaur is sick. The boy held out a small green toy with 1 broken leg. Emily knelt beside him. She reached into her pocket and removed a strip of white medical tape. Carefully, she wrapped the tiny plastic leg. There. The boy's face lit up. He'll be okay now. Emily nodded. He just needs a little rest. His mother smiled. Thank you. Emily stood and continued walking. Richard Kane watched the exchange from the opposite hallway. He saw kindness, patience, nothing threatening. Yet his instincts refused to relax. Inside the ICU, the unidentified patient suddenly opened his eyes. Only halfway. He struggled to breathe. Sarah leaned closer. Can you hear me? His lips moved. Barely audible. There. Inside. Sarah frowned. Who's inside? Before he could answer, the heart monitor began climbing rapidly. Dr. Bennett hurried into the room. Emily appeared seconds later with emergency medication already prepared. Bennett looked surprised. "I didn't call for that. You were about to." Without wasting another second, he took the syringe. The patient's condition stabilized. Again. Emily quietly stepped backward. No explanation. No recognition. Just another nurse helping at the right moment. Daniel Brooks entered the room. "We've got another problem." Bennett looked up. "What now?" The parking lot cameras show 2 more SUVs arriving. Visitors. They parked behind the others. Nobody has gotten out. Emily looked toward the window. 5 vehicles now. Too many. Too organized. She finally reached a conclusion she had hoped was wrong. This hospital wasn't being watched anymore. It was being surrounded. Richard Kane received a silent vibration on his phone. He glanced at the encrypted message. Target confirmed inside. He locked the screen. Then looked calmly toward the ICU. His polite smile disappeared completely. He spoke quietly into the microphone hidden beneath his collar. Phase 2. Nothing dramatic happened. No shouting. No weapons drawn. His team simply began moving. Each man toward a different hallway. Each step measured. Purposeful. Emily watched them from the end of the corridor. She understood exactly what those movements meant. The search was over. The clock above the emergency department quietly changed to 5:41 a.m. A pale gray light had begun to creep across the sky outside Riverside Memorial Hospital, but inside, the night shift still carried the weight of exhaustion. Emily Carter was replacing a box of sterile gloves in Trauma Room 2 when she noticed something unusual. The voices in the hallway had disappeared. Not because the hospital had become empty. Because everyone had stopped talking. She stepped into the corridor. Doctors, nurses, patients who could stand, even family members in the waiting area. All of them were staring toward the large glass entrance. A deep, rhythmic sound rolled across the building. Thump, thump, thump. The windows trembled ever so slightly. Sarah Collins looked toward Emily. "What is that?" Emily didn't answer. She already knew. Outside, several military helicopters descended through the morning mist, their rotors sending leaves and rainwater swirling across the parking lot. Hospital security officers instinctively moved people away from the entrance while visitors watched in stunned silence. Nobody knew why they had come. A convoy of dark government vehicles followed behind them, stopping in an orderly line near the front entrance. The automatic doors slid open. Several uniformed personnel entered the lobby with calm, disciplined expressions. There was no shouting, no panic, no dramatic display. The officer leading them removed his cap before speaking. "My name is Colonel Nathan Hayes." Daniel Brooks stepped forward. "I'm Daniel Brooks. Hospital security." Hayes gave a polite nod. "We appreciate your cooperation." Daniel looked confused. "What's this about?" The colonel glanced across the crowded lobby, scanning faces one by one. Then he asked quietly, "We're looking for Nurse Emily Carter." Daniel blinked. "Our supply nurse?" "Yes." "What do you need with her?" Hayes answered with the same calm tone. "It's important." The words spread through the lobby almost instantly. Several nurses exchanged puzzled looks. Dr. Michael Bennett frowned. "Emily," Sarah whispered. "They came for Emily." No one understood. Emily had worked beside them for years. She stocked supplies, covered extra shifts, helped train new nurses. She was always the first to volunteer when someone needed help. Nothing about her suggested that military officers would arrive asking for her by name. At that moment, Emily stepped into the lobby carrying her familiar gray supply cart. She looked exactly as she always had. Blue scrubs. Simple badge. Hair neatly tied back. No one would have guessed that every eye in the room was about to turn toward her. Colonel Hayes saw her immediately. He walked forward. When he stopped a few feet away, he straightened his posture. Then, without hesitation, he offered a formal salute. The entire lobby fell silent. Sarah's clipboard slipped slightly in her hands. Dr. Bennett stared in disbelief. Daniel Brooks forgot what he was about to say. Emily looked at the colonel for a long moment. Then, with quiet dignity, she returned the salute. "Good morning, Colonel." "Good morning, ma'am." The single word echoed through the room. "Ma'am." "Not nurse. Not Miss Carter. Ma'am." Colonel Hayes lowered his hand. "I never expected to meet you here." Emily gave a faint smile. "Neither did I." He reached into a leather folder and handed her a sealed envelope. "I was instructed to deliver this to you personally." Emily opened it. She read the contents without changing her expression. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully and handed it back. "I understand." Hayes studied her face. "You've been identified." "I know. We can arrange transportation immediately." Emily looked beyond him, toward the emergency department. Patients filled nearly every room. An elderly woman slept peacefully after surgery. A young boy held tightly to his mother's hand. A trauma team hurried another patient toward radiology. Emily slowly shook her head. "I'm staying." The colonel seemed unsurprised. "I thought you might say that. My responsibility is here. You could be in danger. So could everyone else." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Hayes nodded. "As always, you choose the people first." Emily answered quietly. "They're my patients." Behind a nearby hallway corner, Richard Kane watched everything unfold. His confidence vanished. One of his men whispered, "Sir, is that really her?" Kane never looked away from Emily. "Yes. But she's just a nurse." He slowly shook his head. "No." His voice was barely audible. "She's the one we were warned about. Nurse Viper." Across the lobby, Sarah finally found the courage to speak. "Emily." Emily turned. "You never told us." Emily smiled gently. "There wasn't anything to tell." Dr. Bennett looked at her with disbelief. "You've been hiding this all these years." "I wasn't hiding. I simply chose a different life." There was no pride in her voice. No attempt to impress anyone. Only honesty. Colonel Hayes glanced at the busy hospital around them. "It seems you've built exactly the life you wanted." Emily looked toward the nurses' station. "I did. And I intend to protect it." At that moment, every person in the lobby realized the quiet supply nurse they had overlooked for years carried a history none of them had ever imagined. But Emily Carter did not look like a hero. She looked exactly as she had every night before. A nurse. Calm. Steady. Ready to care for the people who needed her. Only now, everyone understood that the name whispered by the colonel. The sun had finally risen. Soft golden light slipped through the tall windows of Riverside Memorial Hospital, but it did little to ease the tension that now filled every corridor. Only minutes earlier, the entire staff had learned that the quiet supply nurse they had worked beside for years was known to someone outside the hospital as Nurse Viper. No one knew what that name truly meant. No one dared to ask. Emily Carter quietly adjusted the sleeves of her blue scrubs and walked back toward the emergency department. She did not rush. She did not look behind her. To everyone watching, it was almost unbelievable. After everything that had just happened, she was returning to work. Sarah Collins caught up with her near the nurses' station. "Emily." Emily stopped. Sarah hesitated before speaking. "Were you really going to go back to stocking supplies?" Emily looked around the busy hallway. A nurse was helping an elderly patient into a wheelchair. A little girl was crying because she was afraid of getting stitches. An exhausted doctor leaned against the wall, trying to finish his coffee before another emergency arrived. Emily smiled gently. "People still need their medicine." Sarah stared at her. "You act like nothing has happened." Emily answered softly. "For the patients, nothing should." Colonel Nathan Hayes watched the exchange from across the lobby. One of the officers standing beside him spoke quietly. "Shouldn't we move her somewhere safe?" Hayes shook his head. "You don't know Emily Carter." The younger officer looked confused. "No, sir." Hayes smiled faintly. "She stopped running from danger a long time ago." Meanwhile, Richard Kane stood inside an empty consultation room on the third floor. The polite smile he had worn all morning had disappeared. He looked through the narrow window in the door. Emily was visible at the far end of the hallway, calmly speaking with an elderly patient. One of Kane's men entered the room. "What now?" Kane remained silent for several seconds. "We underestimated her." "So, we don't underestimate her again." The man nodded. "What about the patient?" Kane looked toward the intensive care unit. "He is still our objective." Emily pushed her supply cart toward the ICU. As she walked, she greeted everyone exactly as she always had. "Morning, Mrs. Harris." The elderly woman smiled. "Good morning, dear." Emily adjusted the blanket over her legs. "Feeling better today?" "A little. I'm glad." She continued walking. A young orderly passed by carrying fresh linens. Emily quietly stopped him. "Take the west hallway." He looked surprised. "I always use this one." "I know. The west hallway is clear." He shrugged. "Okay." Without realizing it, he avoided crossing paths with Richard Kane's team. Dr. Michael Bennett finally caught up with Emily. "I need to ask you something." She nodded. "Of course." He lowered his voice. "Who are those people?" Emily looked toward the ICU doors. "They're here for someone." "The patient?" "Yes." "Is he dangerous?" Emily thought for a moment. "I don't know. But whatever happened before he arrived? It followed him here." Bennett sighed. "I've been a doctor for 20 years. I've never seen anything like this." Emily looked around the emergency department. "Neither have the patients. Let's keep it that way." Inside the ICU, the unidentified man slowly opened his eyes. This time he remained awake. Sarah noticed immediately. "Can you hear me?" He gave the slightest nod. She smiled. "You're safe." His eyes searched the room. Then he whispered one question. "Emily." Sarah looked surprised. "You know her?" The man closed his eyes. Barely audible, he whispered, "Tell her." Before he could finish, exhaustion pulled him back into silence. Emily entered the room a few minutes later. Sarah looked relieved. "He woke up." "What did he say?" "He asked for you." Emily stood beside the patient's bed. For several long seconds, she simply looked at him. The man slowly opened his eyes again. Recognition appeared almost instantly. "You." Emily nodded once. "I'm here." His breathing became steadier. "I thought you were gone." Emily gave a small, tired smile. "So did I." He tried to raise his hand. Emily gently placed it back on the bed. "You need to rest. They'll come." "I know. I'm sorry." Emily looked at him with quiet compassion. "Right now. You're my patient. Nothing else matters." The man's eyes filled with relief. For the first time since arriving at Riverside Memorial, he allowed himself to believe he might survive. Outside the room, Colonel Hayes watched through the small glass window. Daniel Brooks stood beside him. "I don't understand." Hayes smiled faintly. "Most people think battlefields are places filled with explosions." Daniel looked toward Emily. "What do you mean?" Hayes answered without taking his eyes off her. "Sometimes. The hardest battlefield is a hospital." Daniel frowned. Hayes continued. "Out there, people are trained to defeat an enemy. In here, Emily fights for people she's never met. Every single day." At the nurse's station, Sarah quietly watched Emily comforting the frightened patient. She suddenly remembered every night shift they had worked together. Every time Emily stayed late so someone else could go home. Every birthday she quietly celebrated for another nurse. Every extra shift she accepted without complaint. Sarah smiled sadly. "She was never pretending." Dr. Bennett nodded. "No. We were simply seeing the smallest part of who she is." Richard Kane stood alone at the end of the corridor. He watched Emily speaking gently with an elderly patient, then helping a young nurse adjust a monitor. then carrying fresh blankets to pediatrics. She moved through the hospital exactly as she had every day before. Calm. Patient. Kind. Kane shook his head. He had expected someone hardened by the past. Instead, he had found a woman who had chosen compassion over everything else. But he also knew something else. The longer Emily remained inside Riverside Memorial, the more difficult his mission would become. He looked at his watch. His time was running out. And somewhere deep inside the hospital, the quiet life Emily Carter had built over 3 years was about to face its greatest test. The morning shift had fully taken over. Sunlight filled the hallways of Riverside Memorial Hospital, but the warmth it brought never reached the people inside. Doctors continued their rounds. Nurses checked medications. Families waited outside patient rooms, hoping for good news. On the surface, the hospital looked normal. Only a handful of people knew that beneath that routine, every decision carried a quiet sense of urgency. Emily Carter stood at the nurse's station reviewing a patient's medication chart. Her expression was as calm as ever. To anyone passing by, she was simply another nurse beginning another busy day. Sarah Collins walked over carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "I thought you could use this." Emily accepted the cup with a grateful smile. "Thank you." Sarah hesitated. "I've been thinking." Emily looked at her. "I judged you." Emily frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I always thought you stayed in the supply department because you were afraid of responsibility." Emily smiled gently. "I never minded what people thought." "I know." Sarah looked down at her coffee. "I should have asked who you were instead of deciding who you were." Emily shook her head. "You don't need to know who I was." She looked toward the emergency department. "You already know who I am." Sarah smiled for the first time that morning. "A nurse." Emily nodded. "Exactly." Down the hallway, the unidentified patient rested quietly. His condition had improved, but he remained weak. Dr. Michael Bennett checked the latest test results. "He'll recover." Sarah looked relieved. "That's good news." Bennett nodded. "If we can keep him calm." Outside the room, Colonel Nathan Hayes stood beside Daniel Brooks. "The situation is stabilizing," Daniel said. "I hope so." Hayes looked through the glass window toward Emily. "She usually brings calm wherever she goes." Daniel smiled. "I've started to notice." Emily stepped into pediatrics carrying a fresh blanket. A little girl named Lucy looked up from her hospital bed. "Miss Emily." Emily walked over. "Yes." "Will my mom be back soon?" Emily tucked the blanket around her shoulders. "She'll be here as soon as the doctors finish talking with her." Lucy nodded. "I'm scared." Emily gently held her hand. "I know. You don't have to be brave every minute." Lucy smiled faintly. "Will you stay for a little while?" Emily pulled up a chair. "For a few minutes." Outside the room, Sarah watched quietly. She realized something she had never noticed before. Emily never rushed children. Even on the busiest nights. A loud voice echoed from the reception desk. Several visitors had begun arguing after learning that parts of the hospital were temporarily restricted. The raised voices quickly spread tension through the lobby. Families looked worried. Patients became anxious. Daniel moved toward the entrance to calm the situation. Before he reached them, Emily arrived carrying a tray of bottled water. She spoke softly to the waiting families. "There are a few temporary delays this morning. I know it's frustrating. We'll update everyone as soon as we can." Her calm voice changed the atmosphere. People slowly returned to their seats. The argument ended before it could grow. Daniel watched in silence. Sometimes leadership looked nothing like giving orders. Sometimes it was simply helping frightened people feel safe. Later that morning, Sarah found Emily alone in the hospital chapel. The small room was quiet. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows. Emily sat alone for a moment before returning to work. Sarah stepped inside. "I didn't know you came here." Emily smiled. "Only when I need a minute." Sarah sat beside her. "Do you ever regret leaving your old life behind?" Emily looked toward the sunlight on the floor. For a long time. I thought I had. She paused. But then I became a nurse. And I realized something. Sarah waited. There are many ways to protect people. Some require uniforms. She looked down at her blue scrubs. And some look exactly like this. Before Sarah could reply, Daniel appeared at the chapel door. I'm sorry to interrupt. Emily stood. What happened? The patient is awake again. Emily immediately walked toward the intensive care unit. The man looked tired but alert. When he saw Emily, relief crossed his face. I owe you an apology. Emily gently adjusted his blanket. You don't owe me anything. I brought trouble here. Emily looked around the room. This hospital has cared for strangers every day for 50 years. You were never going to be the exception. The man's eyes became wet. I thought no one would help me. Emily answered quietly. That's not how hospitals work. Dr. Bennett stepped into the room carrying new test results. He'll need several more days before he can leave. The patient nodded. I understand. Emily smiled. Then our job is simple. We help you heal. As the afternoon approached, the tension that had filled Riverside Memorial since the early hours slowly began to fade. Staff members returned to their routines. Patients rested. Families began to smile again. Sarah looked across the emergency department. Emily was back where she always seemed happiest. She was checking supplies, replacing empty 4 bags, and quietly asking an elderly patient if he needed another blanket. No applause. No attention. No recognition. Just quiet service. Colonel Hayes watched from the lobby. He turned to Daniel Brooks with a faint smile. Some people spend their lives proving how strong they are. Daniel nodded toward Emily. And some people never have to. Hayes gave one last glance toward the nurse in blue scrubs. The strongest person in this building, he said softly, is the one who keeps choosing compassion. Emily never heard those words. She was already walking toward another patient who needed her help. And for Emily Carter, that was exactly where she wanted to be. The afternoon sun stretched across the windows of Riverside Memorial Hospital. For the first time since dawn, the corridors sounded almost ordinary again. Wheelchairs rolled quietly across polished floors. Doctors discussed treatment plans outside patient rooms. Families spoke in low voices, grateful that loved ones were recovering. To most people, the crisis was over. Emily Carter knew better. Some storms did not end with noise. They ended with one final decision. Emily stood in the central supply room, checking inventory one last time before handing the shift over to the day team. She placed a fresh box of bandages on the shelf, straightened a row of 4 bags, closed the cabinet. Just as she reached for her clipboard, Daniel Brooks appeared in the doorway. You were right. Emily looked up. About what? The people who came here. They weren't interested in the hospital. Emily remained silent. Daniel continued. They only wanted that patient. Emily nodded once. And now? Daniel sighed. They're gone. But I have a feeling this isn't really over. Emily looked at him for a moment. Sometimes people leave. The consequences don't. Down the hall, the unidentified patient sat awake for the first time. His injuries still made every movement painful, but the fear in his eyes had begun to fade. Dr. Michael Bennett smiled as he checked the latest scans. You're healing well. I guess I owe this hospital my life. Bennett chuckled. You owe several nurses. The man glanced toward the hallway. And one in particular. Emily entered the room carrying fresh medication. The patient looked at her with quiet gratitude. I never thanked you. Emily adjusted the 4-line. You don't have to. I brought danger here. You brought injuries. That's what hospitals treat. He lowered his head. I spent years believing people only helped when they expected something in return. Emily smiled softly. Then maybe today changes your mind. For the first time in many days, the man smiled. I think it already has. Outside the room, Sarah Collins watched through the glass. She remembered the first day she had met Emily. She had assumed she was quiet because she lacked confidence. She had assumed she worked in supplies because she could not handle greater responsibility. Now she understood how wrong she had been. Emily had never needed recognition. She had simply chosen service over attention. Colonel Nathan Hayes stood near the hospital entrance, speaking quietly with Daniel Brooks. "Our vehicles are preparing to leave." Daniel nodded. "I suppose this is goodbye." "For now." Daniel hesitated. "Can I ask one question?" Hayes smiled. "You already know the answer." Daniel looked toward Emily. Why would someone with her background choose to become a supply nurse? The colonel watched Emily helping an elderly patient adjust a blanket. After a long silence, he answered, "Because she finally found a place where saving one life at a time was enough." A few minutes later, Emily walked outside. The air smelled fresh after the night's rain. The helicopters still stood in the parking area, their engines now silent. Several crew members were preparing for departure. Colonel Hayes approached her. "I wanted to thank you." Emily shook her head gently. "The staff did their jobs." "So did you." "I only did what every nurse here would have tried to do." Hayes smiled. "That's exactly why you were the right person." He reached into his pocket and removed a small challenge coin bearing a simple emblem. "I've carried this for years." Emily looked at it but made no move to take it. "I don't need another reminder of the past." "I know." Hayes closed his hand around the coin again. "Then I'll keep it." The two shared a quiet smile. No ceremony. No speeches. Just mutual respect. As the helicopters lifted into the afternoon sky, the sound of their rotors slowly faded into the distance. Hospital staff gathered outside for a few moments, watching them disappear beyond the clouds. Sarah turned toward Emily. "So, what happens now?" Emily looked back at the hospital entrance. "Now." She smiled. "My shift isn't over." Sarah laughed softly. "You really mean that?" "I do." Together they walked back inside. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. A child in pediatrics needed a bandage changed. A new ambulance arrived at the emergency entrance. The cafeteria began serving lunch. Phones rang. Monitors beeped. The ordinary work of caring for people continued. Emily slipped on a fresh pair of gloves and pushed her gray supply cart down the hallway. Dr. Bennett called after her. "Emily." She stopped. "I never properly thanked you." She smiled. "The best thank you is making sure no patient waits for care." He nodded. "I can do that." Late that evening, Daniel Brooks reviewed the hospital security footage one last time. On one screen, he watched Emily quietly restocking an emergency cart. On another, she comforted a frightened patient. On another, she helped a new nurse find equipment. He smiled to himself. Some people became extraordinary by standing in front of the world. Others did it by standing quietly beside those who needed them. He closed the monitor. Outside, the last light of day disappeared beyond the horizon. Inside Riverside Memorial Hospital, Emily Carter walked calmly through another corridor, her footsteps as quiet as they had always been. To new employees, she was simply the supply nurse. To the people whose lives she had touched, she was something much greater. Not because of a title, not because of a past, but because, when fear had entered the hospital, she had answered it with compassion, steady hands, and unwavering calm. And by the next morning, the shelves were fully stocked again. Exactly the way Emily liked them.
The next morning arrived quietly. The storm had passed. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of Riverside Memorial Hospital, washing away every trace of the long night that had changed the lives of everyone inside. The emergency department was busy again. Ambulances arrived. Doctors hurried between. Patient rooms. Nurses checked medications. Families waited for good news. To a visitor walking through the front doors, it looked like any other morning. Only the people who had lived through the previous day knew how close the hospital had come to losing its peace. Emily Carter arrived 10 minutes before her shift. She carried the same small lunch bag she had brought every day for the past 3 years. She wore the same neatly pressed blue scrubs, the same black shoes, the same hospital ID. Badge nothing about her appearance suggested that less than 24 hours earlier, military helicopters had landed outside asking for Nurse Viper. She smiled at the receptionist. "Good morning, Linda." Linda smiled back. "Morning, Emily. You've got another busy day." Emily glanced toward the emergency department. "When is it ever quiet?" They both laughed softly. For the first time in 2 days, the hospital felt normal. Emily walked into storage room 3. Everything was exactly where she had left it. She placed her lunch in the small refrigerator, picked up her clipboard, and began checking inventory, one shelf at a time, one cabinet after another. She straightened a row of saline bags, replaced expired gauze, counted emergency airway kits. To anyone watching, it looked like ordinary work. To Emily, it was another way of protecting lives. Prepared hospitals saved people. Prepared nurses saved time. Sometimes, a single minute made the difference. Between life and death, Sarah Collins appeared in the doorway. "I knew I'd find you here." Emily looked up. "Morning." Sarah leaned against the door. "I've been thinking all night." Emily smiled. "That sounds dangerous." Sarah laughed. "It probably is." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Sarah asked the question that had stayed in her mind since the helicopters left. "Can I ask you something?" Emily nodded. "You can ask. You don't have to answer." Sarah took a slow breath. "Who was Nurse Viper?" Emily looked at the shelves in front of her. For several long seconds, she said nothing. Then she picked up another box of gloves and placed it carefully beside the others. "Someone I used to be." Sarah waited. Emily continued, quietly. "I spent many years believing the world could only be changed by chasing danger." She smiled faintly. "Then I became a nurse, and I realized something." Sarah listened carefully, saving one frightened child, helping one exhausted family, comforting one lonely patient. She looked around the supply room. Can matter just as much. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "So you don't miss that life?" Emily thought for a moment. "I miss some of the people, but not the life." Later that morning, Dr. Michael Bennett gathered the emergency department staff. "Before the shift change, I know yesterday was difficult. Several." Nurses nodded. "But I also want everyone to remember something." He looked toward Emily. "Every member of this hospital matters. Doctors, nurses, technicians, housekeeping, maintenance, supply. We only succeed because all of us work together." Emily quietly looked down at her clipboard. She never liked being the center of attention. Fortunately, Dr. Bennett didn't mention her by name. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. The unidentified patient was preparing for transfer to a rehabilitation center. His injuries had improved enough for continued recovery elsewhere. Before leaving, he asked to see Emily. She entered the room carrying a discharge folder. He smiled. "I wanted to say goodbye," Emily returned the smile. "I'm glad you're feeling better." He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know what kind of life you lived before this hospital." Emily remained silent. "But I do know this." He gestured toward the busy hallway. "Outside. The people here are lucky you chose this one." Emily looked around the room. "I'm the lucky one," he frowned. "How?" "Every day I go home knowing I helped someone." She smiled gently. "That's enough." The patient nodded. "I hope I never need another hospital." Emily laughed softly. "I hope so too. But if you do, we'll be here." Outside, Colonel Nathan Hayes sat inside a government vehicle parked across the street. He looked at the hospital one last time. A young officer beside him asked, "Should we tell them who she really is?" Hayes smiled. "They already know. They know she's a nurse. That's the only title she wants." The officer looked through the window. On Emily could be seen pushing her familiar gray supply cart across the emergency department. No one stopped her. No one saluted. No one applauded. She looked happier than she had the day before. Hayes nodded to himself. Some people spend their whole lives searching for purpose. He started the engine. Emily Carter already. Found hers. The vehicle quietly drove. Away. Neither Emily nor anyone inside the hospital noticed. Months passed. Life at Riverside Memorial returned. Completely to normal, new nurses joined the staff. Retired doctors were replaced. Children who had once been patients returned with handmade thank you cards. Every now and then, someone would mention the strange morning when helicopters landed outside the hospital. The story slowly became part of hospital. Legend. Some people exaggerated it. Some insisted it had never happened. Others claimed the military had come for someone else entirely. Emily never corrected anyone. If someone asked, she simply smiled and changed the subject. One rainy evening, almost a year later, a newly hired nurse entered. Storage room 3. She looked around in amazement. I've never seen a supply room this organized. An older nurse smiled. That's Emily. The young nurse laughed. She's only the supply nurse. The older nurse looked toward the hallway where Emily was helping an elderly patient into a wheelchair. She smiled quietly. No, Emily, is never only anything, Emily. Adjusted the patient's blanket. Comfortable? The old man smiled. Much better. She nodded. Good. Then she pushed her gray supply cart down the hallway, disappearing into the familiar rhythm of the hospital. No cameras followed her. No reporters waited outside. No medals hung from her uniform. Only a simple plastic badge. Emily Carter Supply Nurse for everyone else. It was an ordinary title. For Emily, it was the greatest honor she had ever carried. The end.